Hi there, my name's James. I'm usually a coach for like ringette and lacrosse, but I know other stuff too. And while you guys are on coronation right now, I thought maybe I'd do a couple of little videos on different historical concepts that I find interesting, particularly with talking about things that have happened in contemporary history. So that's like things that have happened in my lifetime or things that have happened in my parents' lifetime. So, like, that's kind of talking about stuff that's happened since 1950. I find this stuff particularly interesting, and I hope that you will too. Um, I hope that you're watching this with somebody right now, because unlike in the classroom where you can have some discussion around the topics, it's pretty tough to do when you're just watching it on your phone. So, hopefully, you have someone that you can watch this with, and you can talk about it a little bit. The first concept I wanted to talk about today was South Africa's policy of apartheid. So I want you to picture a society that is incredibly unequal. Picture a place where 20% of the population has everything. Everything. They control government, they control business, they control finance, they control the courts. Everything is controlled by 20% of the population, and 80% of the population has nothing. They're not allowed to go into certain areas. They're not allowed to mix with other people. They have to stay to their own areas, and they're very deprived in these areas. So it's an extreme case of people that have and people that have not. That's what apartheid is, where beginning in the 1940s, South Africa instituted laws that gave white people everything, and indigenous black people had nothing. And this lasted until the early 1990s. And South Africa today is a completely different country than it was 40 years ago. But there's still a long ways to go there as well, because a country isn't built in 25 years. So to take you back to where this all came from. So it's just like in Canada, there's an indigenous population before there was any contact from colonial settlers. The first colonial settlers to South Africa were the Dutch. And as they stayed there longer and longer, their language changed, their attitudes changed, and what was Dutch became an Afrikaner. What was the Dutch language morphed into Afrikaans. Later on, particularly in the Cape Colony, so the southwestern part of South Africa, was where the English came. And they brought with them the ideas of, slavery and more of an industrialization, whereas the Afrikaners were primarily farmers and agrarian. Now, there's many different peoples that lived in South Africa before any of the colonists showed up. Primarily, the biggest ethnic groups were Zulus and the Xhosa. So there's many, many other people that were living there. But I want you just to think just for a second, before we dig any deeper, about how these territories are divided up. So there's a lot of when you look at Africa, there's a lot of lines drawn on the continent that weren't drawn by the African people. They were drawn by European people. So there's really not much correlation between the ethnic groups within the country and what the borders of the country are. So South Africa there was no South Africa before colonialization. You had Zulu peoples, Xhosa peoples, and all the other peoples kind of in their respective areas, living their respective lives. So in the mid-1800s, near present-day Johannesburg, which is in the northern part of South Africa, a couple of really valuable things were found. Things that people kind of like. People like gold, people like diamonds. Guess what? Johannesburg has a lot of this stuff. So there's a lot of tug of war and like war of war between the Afrikaner people and the British people. What you're left with afterwards is the beginning of what would become apartheid, because it was a very segregated society. And that shouldn't come as a huge surprise. We're coming right out of the end of slavery in the British Crown. And there's still a lot of things like eugenics that are in the air, where, the concept was it's a white supremacist society. So there was no equality, and the belief was, an indigenous African person doesn't have the same level of intelligence or ability as a European white person. Obviously, that's nonsense, but that was what the feeling was at the time. So between 1900 and 1948, there was still a very strict segregation. And if you thought about, like, say, what the history of the United States was, around the 1940s, 1950s, as you learn about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, the idea that there was a segregated society in the early 1900s isn't a huge surprise. I mean, Nova Scotia was segregated then as well. But it wasn't necessarily firm law. Now, after World War II, the president of South Africa, he was a believer in the United Nations. And the United Nations weren't super keen about the inequality and the levels of racism in the country. So things started to get softened up a bit. And it wasn't like you would have a black family living next to a white family in a residential neighborhood, but there was more mixing in the workplace. And a lot of people were concerned, a lot of white people were concerned. It's like, this is starting to go down the wrong path. White people there wanted to keep their supremacy. And the idea that any of that would be softening was scary. So in 1948, there's a general election. And the National Party was running on the platform of apartheid. So taking all of these piecemeal pieces of segregation around and codifying it so that there was essentially two nations within the country, one which was in control of everything and had separate everything, and the majority of people who had control over nothing and had separate everything. And guess what? The separate everything for the majority wasn't as good as the stuff that was the separate everything for the minority. So schooling wasn't as good. Access to services weren't as good. I mean, it's a stretch that you have, indoor plumbing in some of these communities, whereas in the white communities, you're living large and it's pretty luxurious. So this worked pretty well for the white people. I mean, they got rich. There's all that gold. There's all those diamonds. South Africa was, more advanced when it came to their banking sector than a lot of areas in southern Africa. So places like Cape Town and Johannesburg, the biggest cities, there's a lot of money and it's into the hands of the very few. The white farmers had much better access to quality land than black farmers would have. So it wasn't particularly fair. I mean, obviously, the whole point wasn't to be fair. The point was that white people would have everything. So what the National Party did is they divided up the peoples of South Africa into 4 categories. So you were either white, black, colored, or Indian. And depending on which category you were in, you had different rights. So whites were favored. They had everything. You're doing okay if you're white in South Africa. Blacks, they had nothing. You weren't doing great if you were black in South Africa. You can guess, cops are kind of all over you. You don't have the same access to capital to grow your business. It's very much you shuffle along and you deal with the scraps that you get. Colored is an interesting concept because what do you do if there's a family that's black and white? Are they white Are they black? Well, that's what colored was sort of designed to cover. That would also cover any other additional ethnicities that would be in the country, such as Chinese or Malaysian. And your final group is Indian. So that would be like Indian. So they were kind of in an in-between place where they didn't have the rights of the whites, but they were doing better than the blacks. So they were something kind of in between. So everyone in South Africa had their identification card to put them into that group. If you were black and you had your identification card saying you were black, you could go into some of these places to do work, like it's not great work, work in a factory, gardening, maids, that kind of stuff. Doesn't matter how smart you are, your opportunities were gardener, maid, factory. So you had strict rules of when you could come in, when you had to be out of the city, and you were going to be checked every single time. It was just like if you were crossing, it was like a passport almost. A passport within your own country to do the things that you need to do to put food on the plate for your family. So what's happened in South Africa is outside of the major urban centers like Cape Town and Johannesburg and Port Elizabeth and Bloemfontein, you had these townships spring up. So you may have heard of the city of Soweto. So that's a portmanteau, I like that word. Portmanteau, which means you take a few letters from a few different things and you turn it into a new word. So Southwestern Township, Soweto. Just outside of Johannesburg. And Johannesburg is your typical modern European-esque city, and Soweto is decidedly not. It's more or less a shanty town. Is there power? Oh, eventually. Is there plumbing? Well, kinda, sort of, in some places. Are there businesses? Sure. Is the dump for Johannesburg right next to Soweto? Yeah. So there's a lot of institutional racism going on. Guess what? I mean, if you lived in Soweto, if you were one of the majority in your country, and you're indigenous to your country, you're probably not in love with all the stuff that's going on. You're not necessarily hating people that are in your country. Surely there's, you're upset that other people that are in your country have different and better opportunities than you have. But this isn't necessarily a black versus white thing. This is a black versus unfairness sort of thing. So various groups pop up in order to fight apartheid. So one of the key groups that does this is the African National Congress, or the ANC. It's what the ANC was to what it became now, because they're the ruling party in South Africa, as we fast forward. What that was it's more or less a paramilitary group. And they wanted to overturn what had been going on in their country. So like some of the things that they'd be involved with is organizing strikes. So it's all well and good if you're inviting the indigenous black people to come into your city to work in your factory. But one of the key powers that you have as a worker is that you can withhold your services. So strikes became commonplace as a method of slowing down the gears to show a level of upset. And I mean, it works to the extent that, no, you're sending a message, but there's other ways that you can send a strong message, like boycotting. So what that means is you're not buying goods and services from people that you want to send a message to. So let's say you disagree with a restaurant's hiring practice. You can decide, I'm not going to go there anymore. And I'm going to tell all my friends not to go there anymore. So think of a bigger scale now, that if there's a product, let's say beer. People like beer, and you'll eventually like beer too, probably. Uh, if everyone en masse decides that they're not going to buy that brand anymore, that's a pretty strong message that's being sent. I mean, you really feel it in your pocketbook. And when rich people stop seeing money pour in, then they get concerned. Another avenue that was being used was civil disobedience. So that's flaunting those laws. So strikes and boycotts, they're perfectly legal. When you get into civil disobedience, those are where you start being like, okay, the end of what I'm looking for is worth being arrested for. It's worth being in a bit of conflict for because it's bigger than me. So when you fight back against police, when you fight back against the colonizers that have put this in place on you, it sends a very strong message. But the problem with those messages is it can end up with some of your key leaders being put in jail and a lot of your people being arrested. One of those key leaders for the ANC is Nelson Mandela. So in the 1960s, he's one of the key leaders for the ANC, but it's not like he's got a ton of respect from the white leaders. They see him as a terrorist. He's seen as a hero amongst ANC supporters. Anyway, in a society like that, his heroism has to wait for a long time because he's thrown in jail in the 1960s and he's stuck in there for 25 years. He didn't kill anybody. It's just he's a dangerous person to the status quo or keeping things the same in South Africa. So he's sent away. He comes back later on in this story, so bear with him because he might be one of the only people you might have heard of out of all of this. So what does the rest of the world think of this? There's a lot going on in the world in the 1960s, in the 1970s, in the 1980s. Something called the Cold War. So you've got United States and their allies on one hand, and you got the Soviet Union and their allies on the other hand. United States, their allies, capitalist-ish. Soviets and their allies, communist-ish. South Africa has always been firmly anti-communist. So the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada and all of those allies have been able to kind of swallow their displeasure with these laws because it's important to have this key ally in keeping the spread of communism down in Southern Africa. Because as times are changing, post-World War II, all of these countries that you see on a map of Africa were all controlled by somebody else. They were controlled by the English or the French or the Belgian or the Portuguese. So over the course of the 50s and 60s and 70s, there's a rapid decolonization. So all of these countries are no longer under the thumb of London or Paris or Brussels or Lisbon. They now have local control. And when you have a lot of these oppressed peoples, the concepts of communism, they're very appealing. So the fight was, when they say a Cold War, it means the Soviets and the Americans never actually fought, but they'd fight by proxy. And you try to build up as many players on your side of the team as possible. So that's what's going on in Africa is, one country will be aligned with the States. The next one will be aligned with the Soviets. The next one will be aligned with the States. The next one will be aligned with the Soviets. This one's with the Soviets this year, they're with the States next year, and with the Soviets the next year. Whatever works best for them. You gotta look out for number one, right? So anyway, South Africa is very firmly anti-communist. So that works well for the States. So they'll hold their nose with all this. And with what we know of American history, it's how mad can they be? It's essentially just a worse version of what's going on there anyway. So they can kind of just do whatever they want. It's not until the 1980s that the tides start to turn on this. So there's various things that happen within South Africa. As you know, the ANC doesn't go away when Mandela's thrown in jail. They continue to fight for their rights. And like, some bad stuff happens to them as well. And you've got some key moments, and one of those key moments leading into the final year of apartheid is the massacre in Soweto. So I just want to find that right date, because we're talking about the 1970s, and I want to make sure that I get everything right here. So there's huge protests on June 16th, 1976. So students from all over Soweto were protesting the change in education in the townships. So these communities outside of the main city, really where the black people live. So the government decides, you know what? Everyone's learning Afrikaans, and we're doing all of our schooling in Afrikaans. I mean, Afrikaans is spoken by about 12% of the population. Let's bear that in mind. So they want to turn everything into Afrikaans. It's an assimilation sort of thing. So approximately 20,000 students take part in this protest. So, I mean, Dartmouth has about 60, 70,000 people in it. So you're talking about probably, you know, if you've been to We Day, it's like 3-4 times the number of people that have been to We Day would be protesting this. Protesting? Why am I saying it that way? Anyway, not a real teacher. So they were met with some extreme police brutality. So I want you to picture, again, all the students of Halifax and Dartmouth coming together to protest something. And instead of what would happen here, which would be, you know, the police would block roads, they'd provide some safety so that you don't get run over or attacked by people. But essentially, if you keep it peaceful, you move along. Well, this was a peaceful protest. But yeah, the cops just shot them up. So, you know, the numbers of protesters killed, it's like ranges from 176 to 700. And these are kids. These are students. This is the next generation. Like, the people that would have been lost in 1976, if you're 16, so you're born in 1960, that'd be people that'd be 60 right now. That'd be the people that'd be running the country right now. So it's crazy to think of that. So, like, this didn't really go over well around the world. And as things softened between the United States and the Soviet Union, and as people became more concerned in the United States, in the UK, and in Canada about really the brutality and unfairness of apartheid, South Africa is being faced with some economic challenges. So there's something called sanctions. You may have heard this in the news before. Essentially, sanctions are something that blocks one party from doing business with another party. So if Canada has sanctions with North Korea, it means we can't sell North Korea paper towel, and North Korea can't sell us, I don't know, chalk? I don't know what to make there. But it blocks trade. So countries begin hitting South Africa with big sanctions. It may be against certain people, it may be against certain companies, it may be against the country as a whole. But when you're a privileged people, like white South Africans, and now your way of life is being challenged because you can't just sell business as usual as you used to, well, now it's turning up the heat on you a bit. And one thing that goes on is the state security system is really beefed up. Like, it's kind of a scary time in the 80s in the homelands, because there's cops everywhere. And these aren't just like cops in a police car, it's like cops in a tank. It's essentially military. And there's people that are collaborating because they keep them safe, and it's a super tense time. But eventually, the tide starts to turn within the minority, that they're not seeing this as being sustainable anymore, because the world doesn't want it. This isn't what the world wants South Africa to be. This is not what they want a society to be. They have their own personal beliefs. I'd like to think, and this is something that's a really good challenge for anybody watching this, is if you've been super privileged, but you're the minority, and it's all been on the backs of somebody else, I'd like to think that I would be against it. And I hope that I would be, but I don't know. But I'd like to think I would be on the right side of history on that. But anyway, a lot of people are starting to get on the right side of history. So as your economic opportunities dwindle, because the world does not have any interest in apartheid anymore. I mean, you weren't allowed, like South Africa wasn't allowed at the Olympics. South Africa, their rugby team, one of the best rugby teams in the world, no one wanted to host them and have games against them because it drove in place what was going on there. It legitimatized. There's the word. I see again, not a teacher. Word's not always at the top of my head. So, the world is essentially saying, no more. Like, this can't go on. And the people of South Africa realize, under President de Klerk, it's like, yeah, this doesn't work anymore. So 1989, Nelson Mandela is released. This is a huge symbolic moment because it's essentially an olive branch from the 20% to the 80% of being like, okay, let's start to make this right. This has gone on too long. Let's get in the process of making things better here. And then there was a referendum, so that's where everybody in South Africa that could vote, worth noting, it's that could vote, because only 20% of the population was allowed to vote. So the white people voted to end apartheid, which is huge. Essentially, is they're saying, we don't want this anymore. This does not work for us. It's not humanitarian. It's not right. Let's also, we can't sell our stuff into the world market anymore either. So let's become a new nation. So let me get my dates right. I want to say 94 was the election. Yeah, it was 1994. So April 27th, 1994, there's the South African general election. So the ANC running. And they've got the first election in South Africa where everyone's allowed to vote. So throw away the white card, the black card, the colored card, the Indian card. Everyone can vote. And there's some really stunning images if you do a little bit of additional research on the subject, of just the lines of people waiting to vote and the excitement to vote. Because for entire lifetimes, people have not had a say in what's gone on where they've lived. So I'm 38 and I've voted in a dozen different elections between federal, provincial, and municipal elections. So for someone that would be the same age as me, like, this is huge. This has been, 20 years of adult life where you've had zero say over anything. And when you thought you had a bit of a say, like things like peaceful protest, it didn't really go all that well for you. So this is huge. It'll come as no surprise that the African National Congress won the election. They had some guy, Nelson Mandela, Nobel Peace Prize winner, excellent man, someone that brought the country together. Yeah, he was running for president, and tough tough not to vote for him. Um, so yeah, they won 60% of the vote, and after this election, things really changed. Essentially, it's the end of old South Africa and beginning of modern day South Africa. So their old flag thrown out, new flag brought in, a multicolored flag that represents all the peoples that live in South Africa. There's growing pains. There's still tons of inequality in South Africa. There's still so many issues there, but it's changed so much for the better because people actually now are in control of their own destiny. And let's still bear in mind that 25 years for a country is still not much time. We're getting now that it's going to be people that are my age that are going to be the ones that'll be in charge in the bureaucracy and in government in the coming years. And it's people like me that 1994, the election, I was 12. So what I remember about apartheid is I knew it happened. Beyond that, I don't know anything. So, obviously it's going to be different for someone that lived through it, but you're going to be shaped differently when the majority of your life has been in freedom and the ability to do things. So the country's on the right path. It's going to take a long time. Will there ever be a day of, will it ever be a utopia where everybody's equal and everyone has the same opportunities? Oh, hopefully. But when you look at sort of post-slavery in the United States, there's still a lot of work going on there. So it's good to see that things are going better, that South Africa's on the right track, and that there's been reconciliation between the different peoples. So there's a lot of other resources out there. I heard there's this really great website. It's called google.ca, and you can Google what apartheid is. Also a great website called Wikipedia. They've got a lot of stuff on there. And just if you find this is kind of an interesting subject, dig into it. Because, a lot of the concepts here, it's a very extreme concept, but there's still a lot of parallels to even Nova Scotia. Because it's not like race relations have been fantastic in Nova Scotia over our lifetime, over the last, since Nova Scotia has become what it is today. Africville is effectively one of these shantytown concepts of what was in South Africa. And that isn't exactly a proud part of our history. So I have some other ideas for things I want to talk about in my rambling talks. Tomorrow I'm thinking about talking about something that's a more basic concept, but was a crazy time when I was 13, which would be the Quebec referendum. So where does the idea of separation, where did that come from? What happened? Why did it get so close to the country breaking up? And why isn't it really being talked about anymore? So that's what I want to talk about tomorrow. I'm wide open to different ideas, if there's things you want to talk about, if there's concepts you want to learn about. It's fun for me to talk about this stuff. Talk to your parents, talk to your classmates. You'll find something that you want to do. So hopefully you got something out of this. And hopefully you find something to do today, because at least it's nice out. But you can't do anything, so it sucks. Anyway, see you later. Thanks for listening.